Wars are not always born from inevitability. More often, they are sparked by political mistakes, choices made in smoky chambers, signed on treaties, or uttered in rash promises. These decisions, sometimes made in arrogance and sometimes in fear, can unleash consequences far beyond what leaders imagine. A single miscalculation can ignite a chain reaction that consumes nations and scars generations. The 20th century especially was a proving ground for these errors. In the span of just a few decades, the world saw two world wars, the collapse of empires, the rise of totalitarian regimes, and violent struggles for independence. None of these events came out of nowhere. Each had its roots in decisions that, at the time, seemed rational to those in power, but proved catastrophic in hindsight. These decisions represent turning points where politics failed, where leaders gambled with the future and lost. Together, these mistakes map a tragic timeline of how human error, pride, and misjudgment plunged the world into wars that killed millions. This is the story of 8 political mistakes that led to catastrophic wars. A warning from history that even the smallest decision made in the wrong moment can ignite a firestorm that changes everything. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914, shocked Europe. To Austria-Hungary, the killing of the heir to its throne was not just an act of terror, it was an attack on its fragile empire. For years, nationalist movements among Slavs had threatened Vienna's authority. The empire was a patchwork of ethnic groups, and the rise of Serbian nationalism had already stoked fears of disintegration. Now, the bullets fired in Sarajevo offered Austria-Hungary an excuse to act. But instead of pursuing careful diplomacy, Austria-Hungary made a fateful mistake. It issued an ultimatum to Serbia designed not for peace, but for rejection. The demands were deliberately harsh, requiring Serbia to suppress nationalist groups, dismiss officials, and allow Austrian investigators to operate inside its borders. It was an ultimatum meant to humiliate, not negotiate. Serbia, under immense pressure, accepted most of the conditions, but not all. That partial refusal was enough for Austria-Hungary to declare war on July 28, 1914. What could have remained a localized crisis spiraled instantly into catastrophe. By choosing provocation over diplomacy, Austria-Hungary set off a domino effect across Europe. Russia mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria, prepared for war. France and Britain were drawn in through alliances. Within weeks, Europe was engulfed in the bloodbath of World War I, a conflict that killed over 16 million people and reshaped the global order. The ultimatum to Serbia stands as one of the clearest examples of how political arrogance can ignite disaster. Hungary's leaders believed a show of strength would preserve their empire. Instead, it hastened its destruction and plunged the entire world into war. Austria-Hungary's harsh ultimatum to Serbia might never have led to world war without the reckless support of its most powerful ally, Germany. In July 1914, as Europe braced for crisis, Austria's leaders hesitated. They feared that punishing Serbia could provoke Russia, Serbia's protector, and potentially trigger a war Austria could not win alone. But then came the assurance that changed everything: the infamous blank check. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, determined to prove loyalty to Austria and assert Germany's place as a great power, promised unconditional support. Whatever Austria chose to do, even if it meant war with Russia, Germany would back it. This pledge emboldened Vienna to take the most aggressive path possible. Austria's ultimatum to Serbia was issued with the confidence that Germany's military might stood firmly behind it. The blank check was a monumental miscalculation. German leaders assumed Russia would back down, that Britain might stay neutral, and that any conflict would be short and containable. Instead, Russia mobilized, France stood by its ally, and Britain, horrified by Germany's invasion of Belgium, declared war. What might have been a Balkan conflict erupted into a full-scale world war. By offering Austria-Hungary unconditional support, Germany turned a regional crisis into a European catastrophe. The blank check was not simply a diplomatic error, it was a gamble with the fate of millions. Rather than preserving the alliance system, it detonated it. Germany's promise to Austria-Hungary in July 1914 remains a haunting reminder of how reckless commitments, made in the heat of pride and loyalty, can unleash forces far beyond anyone's control. Within weeks, the world was at war, and Germany had helped light the match. When World War I ended in 1918, Europe was exhausted. Millions were dead, empires lay in ruins, and leaders gathered at Versailles to forge peace. But instead of reconciliation, the treaty signed in 1919 sowed the seeds of an even deadlier conflict. The political mistake was not simply punishing Germany, it was punishing it so harshly that resentment became inevitable. Germany was forced to accept war guilt, acknowledging full responsibility for the conflict. This clause humiliated a nation that felt the war had been a tragedy of many nations, not theirs alone. On top of this, the treaty imposed crushing reparations, stripping Germany of wealth and industry. Large swaths of territory were seized, colonies taken, and the military reduced to a fraction of its former size. For many Germans, the treaty was not peace, it was humiliation. Families starved during the economic collapse, hyperinflation devoured savings, and veterans returned home to a broken nation that now carried the stigma of guilt. Politicians who signed the treaty were branded as traitors. The Allies believed these terms would secure peace by weakening Germany. In reality, they created fertile soil for extremism. Adolf Hitler exploited this bitterness, weaving the stab-in-the-back myth that Germany had been betrayed by its leaders and enemies within. His promise to overturn Versailles and restore national pride became the rallying cry of the Nazi Party. The Treaty of Versailles was meant to close the book on the war to end all wars. Instead, it wrote the opening chapter of the next. By trading reconciliation for revenge, the victors planted the seeds of World War II. It stands as one of history's greatest examples of how a peace treaty, shaped by arrogance and punishment, can become the blueprint for future war. While Europe was still reeling from the aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression, another spark was lit in Asia. In September 1931, Japan staged the Mukden Incident, a fabricated railway explosion it blamed on Chinese forces, as a pretext to invade Manchuria. Within months, Japanese troops had seized the territory, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo. It was an act of blatant aggression that shocked the world. The mistake, however, was not only Japan's move, it was the global response. The League of Nations, established to prevent wars, condemned the invasion but offered no real consequences. The United States, though concerned, clung to isolationism. Britain and France, themselves weakened by economic crisis, avoided confrontation. Japan faced words, not action. This failure was catastrophic. By allowing Japan to defy international law without punishment, the world sent a message: aggression would not be stopped. Militarists in Tokyo took this as a green light for further expansion, setting their sights on China and eventually Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, other powers, Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany, saw opportunity. If Japan could seize territory without resistance, why couldn't they? The invasion of Manchuria revealed the weakness of the post-WWI order. The League's inability to act decisively turned it into a symbol of impotence. It encouraged dictators everywhere to believe that treaties and condemnations were meaningless without force behind them. What might have been a regional crisis became a turning point in global history. Japan's unpunished aggression marked the beginning of the road to the Second World War. It was proof that peace cannot survive when the guardians of peace refuse to act. The League of Nations was born from hope, the belief that after the horrors of World War I, diplomacy and collective security could keep the peace. But by the 1930s, the League had become a symbol of weakness, a political mistake that allowed aggressors to act unchecked and set the stage for global war. The League's structure was flawed from the start. The United States, despite President Wilson's vision, never joined. Decisions required unanimous approval, making swift action almost impossible. Worse, the League had no standing army. It could condemn aggression, but it could not enforce its resolutions. This weakness became glaringly obvious during the crises of the 1930s. After Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931, The League condemned the act but took no meaningful action. Japan simply withdrew from the organization. In 1935, Mussolini's Italy invaded Ethiopia. The League responded with sanctions, but they were half-hearted, excluding vital resources like oil and coal. Britain and France, fearful of pushing Italy toward Hitler, hesitated. Ethiopia fell, and the League looked powerless. Germany, too, openly defied the League. Hitler rebuilt the military, reoccupied the Rhineland, and later annexed Austria. Each time, the League issued protests but no decisive resistance. To dictators, this was proof that the international community lacked both will and unity. The failure of the League of Nations was not a single blunder, but a series of missed opportunities. Its inability to deter aggression emboldened Japan, Mussolini, and Hitler, making the slide into World War II almost inevitable. What began as an idealistic vision of peace collapsed under the weight of inaction. The League's failure remains one of the clearest lessons of history, that peace cannot be maintained by words alone, but requires the resolve to enforce them. By 1938, Adolf Hitler had already defied the Treaty of Versailles by rearming Germany and annexing Austria. His next target was the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. Hitler claimed he was simply protecting German speakers, but his true goal was expansion. Europe now faced a critical choice: confront him or concede. Britain and France chose concession. At the Munich conference in September 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and French Premier Édouard Daladier agreed to Hitler's demands without Czechoslovakia even at the table. They hoped that by granting the Sudetenland, Hitler would be satisfied and peace would be preserved. Chamberlain famously returned home proclaiming, "Peace for our time." It was a grave miscalculation. Far from being appeased, Hitler saw Munich as proof that Britain and France lacked the will to resist him. Within months, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. The promise of peace was shattered. The mistake of Munich was not just giving up territory, it was showing weakness at a decisive moment. Britain and France had stronger militaries than Germany at that point and could have confronted Hitler before he grew too powerful. Instead, appeasement bought him time to strengthen his forces and prepare for larger conquests. The consequences were catastrophic. Hitler, emboldened, turned his eyes on Poland, confident that the Allies would fold again. This time, they did not, and World War II began. Munich remains one of history's most infamous examples of appeasement. The desire to avoid war is understandable, but when dealing with ruthless ambition, compromise often feeds aggression rather than stopping it. The lesson is clear. Yielding to a dictator rarely prevents war. It only delays it at a higher cost. In the summer of 1939, the world watched in shock as two sworn enemies, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, signed a treaty of friendship. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for the foreign ministers who brokered it, was more than a non-aggression agreement. Hidden within its secret protocols was the division of Eastern Europe between Hitler and Stalin. For Hitler, the pact was a masterstroke. He feared a two-front war if he invaded Poland, with Britain and France to the west and the Soviet Union to the east. By securing Stalin's neutrality, he cleared the path for aggression. For Stalin, the deal seemed pragmatic. It bought time to rebuild the Red Army, which had been crippled by Stalin's purges, while also allowing the USSR to reclaim territory in Eastern Europe. But the pact was a fatal mistake on both sides. On September 1, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, confident that Stalin would not interfere. True to the agreement, the Soviets invaded from the east 2 weeks later, and Poland was carved in two. Britain and France, bound by treaty to defend Poland, declared war on Germany, the official beginning of World War II. The pact not only enabled Hitler's first great conquest, but also undermined Stalin's own security. Less than 2 years later, Hitler betrayed the agreement by launching Operation Barbarossa, a massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Stalin, lulled into complacency by his own gamble, was caught off guard with devastating consequences. The Hitler-Stalin pact stands as a chilling example of how cynical diplomacy can backfire. It bought both dictators temporary gains, but at the cost of unleashing the deadliest war in human history. In trying to manipulate chaos, both leaders ended up feeding it. As World War II ended, Britain faced a crumbling empire and mounting pressure to withdraw from India, its most prized colony. Indian nationalists, led by figures like Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, demanded independence. But the independence movement was fractured by religious division. Hindus largely supported the Indian National Congress, while many Muslims, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, pushed for a separate nation, Pakistan. Eager to exit quickly, Britain made a fateful mistake. It rushed the process. In 1947, with little planning, British officials drew new borders dividing India and Pakistan almost overnight. The partition was poorly managed, with lines drawn hastily by a British lawyer who had never visited India before. Entire communities found themselves on the wrong side of the border. Millions were forced to flee ancestral homes in one of the largest mass migrations in history. The result was chaos. Trains packed with refugees were attacked, villages burned, and hundreds of thousands slaughtered in communal violence. Families were torn apart, and an estimated 10 to 15 million people were displaced. The human suffering was immense. Worse, the partition planted the seeds of enduring conflict. India and Pakistan fought multiple wars over disputed territories, most notably Kashmir, and tensions between the two nuclear-armed nations continue today. What was meant to be a solution became a source of endless strife. The Partition of India is a stark reminder that political mistakes are not always made in moments of aggression. Sometimes they come from haste, neglect, or failure to foresee consequences. By rushing independence without proper planning, Britain left behind a legacy of division and bloodshed. Instead of resolving tensions, the partition ensured that one of the world's most volatile rivalries would define South Asia for generations. History is often told through battles and generals, but wars do not begin on the battlefield. They begin in council chambers, at treaty tables, and in the words of leaders who misjudge the moment. The 8 political mistakes we have traced show how decisions meant to project strength, preserve peace, or settle disputes instead unleashed chaos on a global scale. The lesson is clear. Political mistakes carry costs measured not in speeches or signatures, but in millions of lives. Leaders who miscalculate, underestimate enemies, or sacrifice principle for convenience often create disasters far greater than the ones they hope to avoid. These stories are not just relics of the past. They remain warnings for the present. In a world still filled with rivalries, nationalism, and fragile peace, the margin for error is slim. History reminds us that the gravest danger in politics is not always the enemy across the border, but the mistake waiting to be made at home. Wars are not accidents. They are the product of choices, and the cost of those choices can echo for generations.